Thank you for tuning in to this presentation. My name is Tommy Fenster. I am a graduate student researcher with the Ecdysis Foundation as well as Cal State East Bay over in Hayward, California. Today I'm going to be talking about the study I've been doing for my master's thesis, looking at a comparison between regenerative and conventional almond orchards in California. And then looking at throughout the entire system, so all the way from the soil quality to the biodiversity to the economics of the system. So just a brief summary of what is the Ecdysis Foundation. So the Ecdysis Foundation is founded by my advisor, Dr. John Lundgren, and it is a nonprofit research institution with its main headquarters based in Esteline, South Dakota, whose role is to do research with regards to regenerative agriculture that's driven by the questions that the farmers have who are practicing regenerative systems or who are looking to transition into a regenerative system. What's also kind of unique about this Ecdysis Foundation is that it's also partnered with a for-profit farm called Blue Dasher Farm, in which John and the other parts of the Ecdysis team are actively farming that land and are have to make the profit on it while they're also able to practice and have a first-hand experience understanding issues that producers who are going regenerative are having. So on that note, we'll kind of hop on into the presentation. So the first thing is define what is regenerative agriculture for some of those who may not be familiar. So the main goal of farming is to create a profit as well as to create good nutrient-rich food for the consumer at the end. Though how regenerative agriculture differs than traditional conventional agriculture is that with regenerative agriculture, what we're trying to do is to have the soil health and biodiversity really drive that profit and that nutrient density in the food. So things that increase soil quality, like having cover crops, using organic amendments, and things that also drive biodiversity. And the hope is that you can potentially maybe have even more profitable operation by maybe being able to reduce some of our input costs that come along with a conventional agricultural operation. And the other thing is also creating an agricultural system that's also creating better health outcomes for the surrounding farm community as well. So by able to avoid some of these synthetic inputs and like the pesticides and the herbicides, be able to create a healthier community as well too. But the key idea of regenerative agriculture is that we are trying to build the soil quality, and that good quality, higher quality soil with more diverse microbial communities leads to overall greater outcomes in general. For more biodiversity, and where you have a greater biodiversity in your plant community, which is then driving greater biodiversity in your vertebrate community and providing some of these key environmental services such as pest control, or even building up nutrients and fertility in your soil. So to go about getting a regenerative operation, regenerative agriculture relies on these four key principles. The first being to minimize soil disturbance. So this is really in the form of eliminating tillage. When we till the land, we break up a lot of that soil structure, a lot of the water infiltration. We also can lose a lot of sort of the carbon, which is driving the fertility in the soil. The other key part is to not leave the soil bare. This is sort of a really pretty big issue in California almond orchards. Not many California almond orchards really till anymore, but a lot of them, the conventional orchards, the soil is bare for large parts of the year. But when the soil is bare, it exposes it to erosion where we're losing that topsoil. It also exposes it to the heat so that the soil will heat up a lot more, and it can causes shifts with regards into that soil community. The other key part is bringing in those living roots and diversity in the plant community. So some is better than none, and more is better than less. So really the plants are some of these key drivers with regards to an agroecosystem or an ecosystem in general. Plants are the way in which energy enters the system. We have bare soil, then we're not getting that energy from the sun through the photosynthesis out through the root exudates out into the environment. And then with regards to plant biodiversity, plant diversity drives the overall diversity from the microbial communities to the invertebrate community, And that's how we get a lot of some of these environmental services that come with regenerative agriculture, such as pest suppression and the microbial, as well as in the insect form. And the other key part is integrate crops and livestock. As you can see here, this is an almond orchard in the Capay Valley with sheep integrated into the orchard, grazing the cover crop. The key part is, a lot of our plant communities, they evolved with grazers. They function best with grazers. Grazers come in, they bring it down, they supply the nutrients, they stimulate that growth. And it's can be really important with regards to, in a farm operation, to have these livestock in there. They can speed up nutrient cycle. For example, with regards to this almond orchard, instead of having to mow the orchard, the farmer likes to say to me, he gets to, tell his family he's mowing the orchard, and he gets to sit on his porch and drink a beer and watch the sheep graze away. That's one environmental service right there. But the other part is that instead of having to bring in manure or other additional amendments or fertilizer, what he's doing is he's having the sheep break down his cover crop. He can drink a beer, and his trees are getting the nutrients. So it's sort of a win-win-win for everyone. And that's the idea of regenerative agriculture, is to stack a variety of principles, have them work in concert, build off one another, and create this whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So, with regards to almond orchards, in particular, we have some key questions with regards to these regenerative operations. So, does it work? Are these regenerative operations, are they successful? Can these practices of regenerative management, can they replace or reduce the need for synthetic fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides, while also creating value for the orchard? Maybe that's in the way of cost savings. Maybe that's in the way of creating an end product, an almond, that's more highly valued by the consumer who's willing to potentially pay more of it. And then within that, since we're going out and looking at working regenerative operations, they had actually a mix of regenerative practices, but this allowed us to have some fun with some of the statistical analysis, is kind of tease out maybe if there are some key management practices here that are really important and potentially really driving some of the results that we're seeing. And then the final part is is really this interesting, what is the relationship between the biological community and pest damage and soil quality? So do you have this interactions in which you have maybe a diverse invertebrate community providing pest suppression for the farmer? Or maybe it's how is the microbial community impacting soil fertility and carbon? And is there even a relationship between this invertebrate and the microbial community and all this that's going on? And really understand, what's making these systems tick. So that's what we were really fascinated to ask. And, sort of a key part too is that, with regards to these questions, we just didn't come up with them on our own. These questions were formulated by engaging with the stakeholders, the farmers and the beekeepers themselves, with regards to trying to figure out, what's going on and what's important. So, I just didn't sit down one day and come up with it. Actually, other people really, the farmers really came up with these questions, and it was up to me to try to figure out how to answer them. So, for this study itself, to find what is a regenerative orchard. And that's sort of a challenge that we had. But fortunately, the Ecdysis Foundation has been doing this research for a number of years before I came, and has had success with regards to quantifying regenerative corn operations and regenerative grazing operations in the Midwest. And they came up with this great idea of this matrix. So we've laid out these practices which fall under the regenerative principles, and you ask farmers, you go out, do you do this or don't you do this? And then you get an overall score. It's a really pretty simple, straightforward way to go about this. And for the sake of this study, we decided, the idea of regenerative agriculture is that you're taking a systems approach. You're not just doing one practice, such as not tilling or using organic amendments, but you're really doing a variety of practices, aligning with those 4 principles, and really taking a systems approach. So, as there are 4 principles, regenerative ag principles, we figured sort of a good definition, a good cutoff would be when if a farm got a score greater than 4, it meant that they were integrating a wide diversity of practices, and really we're taking that regenerative systems-based approach. So going here, I have an example of just two of the farms from the study. We have a regenerative one on top, a conventional one on the bottom. It's as simple as going through, are there hedgerows on the farm? You can see the regenerative, yes, 1. Conventional, no, 0. Grazers, neither had grazers. Does it use no synthetic fertilizers? Then compost teas, no synthetic herbicides, no synthetic insecticides, no synthetic fungicides. For this, we also actually included organic improved metal-based fungicides, as the research does suggest that they have somewhat of it can have a negative impact on the environment. No tilling, and then is there permanent orchard floor ground coverage, where the floor is covered at a 75 to 100% range throughout the entire year. And this one we had a little bit of a wiggle room. For example, if at harvest time, some of these orchard floors can get mowed really down. So if a orchard had that 75 to 100% ground coverage at 2 of the 3 visits, we gave them a 0.5. If they had it at all of them, they got a 1. As you can see here, then they get a total score. But if you look at it too, the conventional farm is, it got a 2. It actually is not, that bad if you think about it. They're using organic amendments, and they're not tilling, which are, that's 2 of 4 regenerative principles. So it really created this good fascination, because it really is we're trying to quantify these real world farms in which maybe a conventional, a lot of farms that are conventional, especially orchards in California, aren't just not doing any of these principles. They are maybe doing a couple of principles, and really get this real world comparison between these farming systems. And with a little bit of this variety, the statistics really made it really interesting to see what's driving these differences in the system. So we kind of went over what are these practices, how did we define these differences in a regenerative orchard as we began the study. And now I'm going to go through is I'm going to show you just some pictures to really highlight what we were comparing. So you can see here, this is one of my favorite pictures. This is the regenerative farm, and it's neighboring conventional farm. We paired each regenerative farm to neighboring conventional for this study. You can see this is not photoshopped or anything. It is just a panorama, and they are literally just separated by that dirt road running between them. And I think this really kind of highlights some of the comparisons of the different management systems we are looking at. So when we're looking at these orchards, our regenerative orchards, they had significantly more plant species. Their median ground coverage range was in the 75 to 100% range, while the conventional orchards, looking at this ones, were in the 0 to 25% range. So really, some stark differences. And it's interesting too, this regenerative orchard actually is really actually beat the yields of this neighboring conventional one by quite a lot. So going into more, what do these regenerative orchards look like? We also had regenerative orchards that integrated grazers. So here we can see here, this is chicken tractors at one of the regenerative orchards in this study moving through. So I believe these were egg layers. So in addition to making money off the almonds, these producers were also making money off the egg layers, as well as getting that nutrient cycling through the manure, as well as potentially some other services as well too. Here's another regenerative orchard that also these chickens were broilers that they were raising in there, so raising them for meat. And then here's an orchard, a creative use of how to control for potentially for the plant community within the orchard tree row. So they used a burning technique. So it's kind of a mixture through some orchards who really managed it within the tree rows themselves and burned down, and others who, if we go back to this first one, they just kind of let stuff grow within the tree rows. So kind of a little bit of a mixture of approaches. Also the key part too, is that permanent ground cover. We reckon that, in California, you're probably, some cases you're not gonna be watering your cover crop through the summer, but it doesn't mean that ground cover isn't playing a role in the form of mulch. So we see right here, this is during our June fruiting sampling, but this really nice thick layer of mulch between the orchard tree rows that are protecting the soil, preventing from erosion, while also providing still a lot of energy and nutrients for the invertebrate community, and even finding and sampling worms and whatnot, even in June in the Central Valley, which is really quite impressive. And this is sort of here what a lot of the conventional orchards resemble. So bare orchard floors, pretty chemically mowed to keep them really bare. as well, the range of synthetic inputs. We did have some conventional orchards, which did have, a little bit, more ground cover than is, highlighted in these pictures here. But you really can see, I think this picture is somewhat highlighting where we're beginning to lose some of the functioning that we were expecting of the soil. This is an irrigation then in the summer, and we just have water that's not infiltrating down. This is just evaporating, it's losing. So we're losing this resource, and the soil is just not functioning how a farmer wants their soil to be functioning in this picture. If you can see that water glistening, reflecting, and just kind of standing and pooling there. And that's not like an irrigation break or anything like that. It's just the soil just not infiltrating. So how did we design this study? So what we did was we went out and we found 8 regenerative orchards, and what we did once we found the regenerative orchards, talked to them, interviewed them, got a sense, okay, this is an orchard, they're following these regenerative principles, they'll meet our matrix category. Asked them, do you have a neighbor who's farming conventionally who will want to be part of this study? And they said yes, and they found their friendly neighbor, and the neighbor very gracious and obliged to be a part of our study. And what this was a snapshot study. We sampled 4 regenerative orchards and 4 conventional orchards in 2018, and another new 4 and 4 in 2019. Within each one of these orchards, we broke them into 4 40 by 40 meter plots where we could go out and do our sampling. And we did our sampling at 3 kind of major points throughout the year: at the bloom, during the fruiting in June, and then at harvest time as well. And the key part when we're pairing it with the neighbors is that the conventional orchards also need to be of a similar soil type. So that's something that it's kind of hard in these real world studies to control for everything, but this was a key one that we really needed and made a strong effort and successfully controlled for. The soil texture can have a really big impact around with regards to the carbon in the soil, nutrients, all of that stuff. So it's a really key part for us to look at. And then our orchards had a nice range. They ranged up from Chico, in the northern part of the Central Valley and the Sacramento portion of the valley, down through the Capay Valley, and then further south into the San Joaquin portion of in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley. And we got about as far south as Turlock. But throughout these, we did get a nice diversity of almond production systems in the state of California. I'm going through a range of soil textures, from more clay-heavy soils up in Chico in the Capay Valley to more sandier soils down in the San Joaquin Valley. So yeah, that's how we went out. These are active, all working, real-world farms. These are not. It's not us going out and setting up these some small research plots in the farm. So we really feel like we did a good job of going out there and working to quantify real-world operations. So the measurements that we do, so a key part of not only for the farmers with regards to regenerative agriculture in terms of them taking a systems approach, as scientists, it's really imperative on us to take a systems approach as well too. So this means sampling throughout the entire, sampling all the way down from the soil quality. So looking at total soil carbon and nitrogen down to 60 centimeters. With this, we looked at 0 to 5 centimeters, 5 to 10, 10 to 15 centimeters, and 15 to 30, 30 to 45, and 45 to 60 centimeters. So we really got a good idea of where is the carbon and nitrogen in these systems, what's happening to it, where are the differences between the systems. We also looked at the soil organic matter, essentially the soil organic carbon portion of the soil in the top 15 centimeters. Then we looked at soil function and soil structure in the form of water infiltration and bulk density, respectively. Then moving up, entering our biological communities, we looked at microbial biomass and diversity in the top 10 centimeters. We utilized PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid testing for that. And then as a part of this microbial and soil functioning aspect, we also did Haney soil health scores for these farms. So this was something that's developed by USDA scientist, Dr. Rick Haney. It's something that's beginning to take a bit more momentum, I guess definitely throughout the Midwest. And it was a metric that farmers themselves were pretty fascinated in. And we're also kind of interested to see what the results of it as well too. So we were able to partner with Ward Labs as well as Regenerative Ag Labs to do some of our analysis, and they were able to provide these Haney soil health scores as well too. And what they do is they take into account the most labile forms of the carbon and the nitrogen and the water extractable forms, and look at that in conjunction with regards to the amount of CO2 is emitted to see an idea of how well these soils are functioning and cycling nutrients. And then moving up from that, we also engaged in looking at the ground level invertebrate community. So we looked at biomass and diversity. Over the course of the study, we collected over 12,000 invertebrates and identified all of them to the morphospecies level. And then what we also did is we went out at harvest and we collected 500 almonds per farm in the first year, 600 almonds in the second year, and we did that, and we followed the collection guidelines put out by the UC Cooperative Extension, and we analyzed them for pest damage to see what are the differences and what were maybe potentially driving maybe any differences we were seeing. Then the final sort of metric, biological-ish metric, is looking at the nutrient profile of the almonds themselves too. So are these different systems giving us different nutrient profiles with the almonds? And then finally, we looked at the overall yield as well as the profitability of the operations. We got these results in the form of farmer surveys, where we also quantified all the practices that they were doing, the various and where the costs were coming from. So you can see, this is quite the systems approach, and the idea is to understand, what are the potential interactions that are going on? What is driving some of these? If we are seeing differences between these regenerative and conventional systems, what's driving them? Is it a stronger biological community, for example, that's influencing greater soil fertility? So right here, here's just a picture of an example of some of that sampling. We have Ali doing our invertebrate sampling at the ground level. What we did, we put down these quadrats, 2 per plot, and we sucked up everything that we found in that quadrat, as well as sort of the very top layer of soil, sort of scraping around in there. Over here you see Chris taking some of our deep soil carbon and nitrogen samplings and segmenting them out into the intervals I discussed. And in the middle picture you see at harvest time, where we went out for the collection of the almonds to examine them for pest damage and then also do nutrient analysis. So as I discussed earlier, soil texture was a key thing we wanted to control for. And we used the web soil survey initially to make sure that they were paired up. And then we also did hydrometer tests to verify it. And what we found is that there's no difference whatsoever between soil textures, between our regenerative and overall conventional operations. We did a really good job pairing them up. You see our p-values for sand and silt are 1. For clay, it's 0.89. So, no difference, whatsoever, which is, always a good thing to know. So now we have that baseline established. So, big question: were there differences between these regenerative and these conventional operations? And yes, there were significant big differences. So, well, first I'm going to kind of bring it in and look at the overall, somewhat at the big picture, and then I'll go in and look at the differences between kind of each one of these components that we sampled for. So first off, what we have here is these are our Mancova and Manova models, in which we are looking at what is the effect of an orchard being regenerative on an orchard's soil carbon, bulk density, total phosphorus, microbial biomass, actinobacteria biomass, and invertebrate diversity. And what we found was that the difference is significant. With regards to the models that we have here, they're all very similar. The top two include clay as a covariate, as we found that clay is a significant factor in determining soil carbon as we move down into the deeper layers. And the first one goes as we're looking at the layer from the 0 to the 60 centimeter layer. And then the second one is the 0 to the 30 centimeter layer. So what you'll see is this 0 to 6,000. You'll see this throughout on metric tons equivalent soil mass layer, and then you'll see 0 to 3,000 metric tons equivalent soil mass layer. And what we did, there's a technique with regards to control for the compaction that can come with sampling. Regarding the, this is a way to control for that, this equivalent soil mass technique. So instead of seeing 0 to 60 centimeters, you'll see 0 to 6,000, 0 to 3,000. And then our final model is looking at the effect, with regards to carbon in the very top layer, that 0 to 5 centimeters, 0 to 500, in which we did not include clay as a covariance. So this was found not to really have an effect on that carbon in the very top layer of the soil. And with these p-values, what we're seeing, what is cool about this Mancover and Manova is that we can kind of control for some of this potential collinearity between some of these metrics. And by looking at this and seeing that an orchard being regenerative has an effect on all these combined in the one model is really, really quite significant. And what that effect is greater soil carbon, lower bulk densities, greater overall total phosphorus, greater microbial biomass, and the actinobacterial biomass, as well as improved biodiversity. So it seems like, our first big question, are these regenerative and conventional systems different? And yes, they are really quite different. So moving down into, each one of these particular metrics. So our mean bulk density with regards to our conventional orchards is 1.3 grams per centimeter cubed. Regenerative is 1.16 grams per centimeter cubed. And this bulk density is in some cases maybe not too surprising to see. There's a picture of taking a bulk density sample, but these regenerative orchards generally, they used organic amendments in conjunction with maintaining a permanent ground cover. So you have these roots, going down into soil, creating more space within the soil itself, more air. It doesn't allow it to get compact because there's a lot of heavy machinery that move through almond orchards on a routine basis. And with regards to this bulk density, not only providing overall better structure for there to be a soil community to live in, it also seems to have some really strong implications with regards to function too. This is assuming looking at water infiltration rates between regenerative and conventional orchards. And the regenerative orchards had water infiltration rates that were about 6 times as fast as their conventional counterparts. And this has some really pretty big practical implications with regards to California. California has the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, requiring this recharge of groundwater. But what happens is too often the case in California, we have these big winter rain events, but instead of this water getting trapped, infiltrating and going down and potentially recharging there, we have this water that's not infiltrating, it's standing, it's running off, and it's taking soil and the fertility as well as potentially nitrates along with it. Right here is just a picture of me driving out to do some work in Chico after a big rain event. You can see these orchards were just all completely flooded out, and I just kind of think this picture kind of highlights the potential role that having these orchards that can infiltrate water more effectively. And this is not also terribly surprising. As you can see here, these regenerative orchards have lower bulk densities, they have greater soil carbon, so that they are infiltrating water, and really it kind of makes sense. And additionally, with having that higher soil carbon in there, that greater organic matter, especially not only are they infiltrating water more, that they probably have a greater water holding capacity as well too. So moving now to this differences between looking at soil carbon and soil nitrogen. This is looking at differences in total soil carbon and total soil nitrogen and the 0 to 6,000 metric tons equivalent soil mass layer, essentially 0 to 60 centimeters. And seeing significant differences. The regenerative orchards average 31% more metric tons of carbon per hectare to a depth of 60 centimeters, which is really quite impressive, this more than 31% more. We didn't do a full carbon life cycle analysis in this study, but these findings do suggest that regenerative agriculture could play this key role as the state of California really tries to increase the amount of carbon sequestration that's happening on its working lands. The other kind of key thing to note is that the orchards also had regenerative orchards had significantly higher amounts of total soil nitrogen as well too. So it really looks like these regenerative orchards, these two key metrics of soil fertility, are outperforming their conventional counterparts. The other key thing to talk about here is with regards to the C/N ratios. The C/N ratios in the regenerative orchards were roughly about 9:1, and the conventional orchards, they were roughly about 8:1. So that's sort of right in that sweet spot to assume that there's this effective cycling of nutrients, and that the key nutrients the trees need are not getting bound up by an excess of carbon. So both systems are going through and doing well in that. So we're going to do in the next slide, we showed through our sampling depth of 0 to 60 centimeters. Regenerative orchards have significantly more carbon and nitrogen when you look at that full profile. But really the interesting part is, where is that carbon at? And my apologies, this chart is maybe not the most user friendly thing. One day I will make graphs of this, I swear. But what we're seeing is that the largest percentage of carbon, if we break it into 5 centimeter intervals, the largest amount of carbon and nitrogen are occurring in that top 5 centimeters. And as we move down, we're really seeing the difference. We're seeing the differences that are between those regenerative and conventional orchards in that top 30 centimeters. So if we look at just the amount of carbon in 30 to 60 centimeter range, there's no difference between in carbon nitrogen between these regenerative and these conventional orchards. So this really speaks to the fact it takes a long time for this carbon to really significantly work down to greater depths, and it also highlights the fact of almost the fragility, to say, of this carbon, with the most of it being packed in this majority, the largest percentage being packed in this top 5 centimeters. You can really see how an orchard manages its ground cover is going to have a really big impact on the amount of carbon that's found in its orchard. You can really see, potentially how important it is just maintaining some permanent ground cover to prevent that loss of carbon if so much is concentrated in the top of it. Yeah, I think that's good on that slide. And what we also were able to do is with these orchards, was really interesting. So our orchards range in years, I believe, from 3 years to 38 years. So it allowed us to do some fun analysis, and we looked at the impact of years under regenerative management and years under conventional management. And with doing this analysis, we found out the regenerative orchards are gaining carbon, while the conventional orchards are losing carbon. And this aligns with our thoughts. When you don't have ground cover, you're not using organic amendments, you're really making that soil prone to erosion. And that really seems to be the case here, that these conventional orchards are slowly losing their fertility over time, while these regenerative orchards are slowly building their fertility. And with regards to our multiple regression analysis, we did find, with that analysis of all those practices I talked about in the beginning that we use to define regenerative and conventional orchards, that maintaining permanent ground cover came out as being sort of that critical thing for maintaining carbon within the soils. So sort of a nice, interesting tidbit, to know of, how there were challenges somewhat within the study design. It also did present interesting opportunities to analyze and understand what's happening within those systems. I should note, though, that that 3-year-old orchard, we did not count its yield data or anything, so don't worry about that. We recognize it's too young to count as yield, but it did allow for this fun analysis. Right here, we also looked at the overall soil macronutrients found within the orchards. If it is highlighted and it is bolded, it means there's a significant difference between the regenerative and the conventional orchards. We found that regenerative orchards have significantly more organic matter, more water extractable organic nitrogen, as well as more water extractable organic carbon. These are the most labile forms of nitrogen and carbon, respectively, the ones that are sort of most available for the microbial community and really that feed and drive the system. We found that regenerative orchards have significantly more phosphorus, total phosphorus and inorganic phosphorus, as well as calcium and aluminum, and I think conventional orchards have slightly higher aluminum levels, yes, and then as well as sulfur and available phosphorus. So overall, a lot of these, no difference between the conventional orchards, but there were some key differences. And really, what this suggests is that these regenerative management systems are doing just as good as a job as the conventional systems with regards to getting the needed nutrients for the trees, and in some cases are outperforming their conventional counterparts. So moving up, to now we're beginning to entering the microbial, our biological communities. Regenerative orchards had about twice the microbial biomass as their conventional counterparts. Looking at the literature, the microbial community can be a key part with regards to getting nutrients to the trees, as well as also building up carbon in the soil. If you look at this, you have another one of these charts where we highlight in bold where there were significant differences between the two. So regenerative orchards had significantly more microbial biomass, greater total bacterial biomass, gram-positive biomass, and greater actinobacterial biomass, actinobacteria being a member of the gram-positive group. And actinobacteria are sort of a key indicator of soil fertility and are a really key part of that soil ecosystem with regards to getting nutrients into the tree and are considered a key indicator. Regarding the arbuscular and mycorrhizal community, it was not a significant difference. Our p-value 0.052. It's a pretty interesting p-value, how close it is to that 0.05 significance level. So something can be really fascinating to explore in future studies as well to go in more in depth. I think for the overall microbial community, this is something that we're going to explore more in depth and do more expansive and sampling at the microbial community as well. So I think some of these metrics are just kind of like teasing, a little bit of a tease. There's some interesting stuff going on, but looking forward to getting more in depth on future studies. Building up with regards to that microbial community, with regards to Haney health scores, regenerative orchards had scored on significantly higher with regards to their these Haney soil health scores. These Haney soil health scores, they should be recognized. They're in an index, and just like any index, taken with a grain of salt, but they do seem to suggest that there is this significantly greater activity happening, which the microbial community is getting these key nutrients to the trees, and that these regenerative orchards also have the key food that fuel these microbial communities in the form of this water extractable organic carbon and water extractable organic nitrogen. So in the context of everything else, these Haney health scores make sense with regards to rating regenerative orchards as being having significantly greater soil health than their conventional counterparts. Moving off into the invertebrates. So we identified over 275 different invertebrate morphospecies from the almond orchards, totaling 12,414 individuals. And what we found is that these regenerative orchards had significantly more invertebrates. I think their biomass is about, six times the overall biomass of their conventional counterparts, and were significantly more diverse. Right here we have the diversity Shannon H index. And that's really great from a science and ecological standpoint, which we have overall biodiversity declines, especially in the Central Valley, but this also seems to be potentially providing a key role to farmers as well. So when we looked at the differences in pest damage between the two orchards, there's no difference in pest damage between the regenerative and the conventional orchards. And wondering somewhat, how is this the case? The conventional orchards are spraying a bunch of synthetic pesticides, et cetera. And with our analysis, we were able to potentially hypothesize is that the greater diversity of these regenerative orchards is creating a more complex ecosystem in which it's harder for these pest species to gain a foothold within the system, and that this overall diversity is providing pest control. So we found a significant correlation between increasing diversity and reduced pest damage. And so since the regenerative orchards has significantly higher diversity than the conventional orchards, and there's no difference between the two, we hypothesize that this greater invertebrate biodiversity is really providing sort of this pest control suppression. So that's what we hypothesized based on this significant correlation that we found. Also the key thing to remember is that regenerative orchards have more complex landscapes. They average between the 75 to 100% ground cover and more plant species than the conventional orchards. And we think about it, plant diversity and ground cover drive diversity throughout the entire system. So it's not, this fact is that these more complex landscapes seem to be creating this in more complex ecosystems, as well as these more diverse complex communities which are potentially providing pest suppression. At least that's what we hypothesize, and the correlation. It'll be interesting to potentially look into further. But this does align with a lot of the prevailing literature, which sees biodiversity, increasing biodiversity, providing a key pest suppression role. And right here we just have, let's see, a praying mantis and a small spider in the family Lymphitidae out here, sort of just highlighting maybe some of these complex communities which are controlling for the pests. And now, sort of the big question, was there going to be a difference in yield between the regenerative and conventional orchards? I hypothesized yes. I thought going into this study that conventional orchards would have significantly higher yields than their regenerative counterparts. And what we found was that there's no difference in yields between the two orchards types. Our two top yielding orchards was a conventional and a regenerative orchard respectively. The top yielding conventional orchard brought in 2,700 pounds. The number one yield was at 2,700 pounds an acre, and number two is a regenerative orchard at 2,200 pounds an acre. And overall, with regards to our yields, wondering how to, were we looking at conventional farms that, are really, sort of the industry standard. We checked it out. The mean conventional yield that we found was right in line with the county means where the orchards were located. So it seems to be, that we picked the orchards we picked are, right in line with the industry standard. And it seems that regenerative orchards, this more robust ecosystem, is supplying the service of similar yields to their conventional counterparts. Going into the almond nutrient profiles, overall, really, no difference between the almond nutrient breakdown between the two different orchards. This kind of falls right in with regards to the yield. It looks like these regenerative orchards and conventional orchards are both getting the sufficient nutrients needed to the trees to make them provide the nutrients needed in the almonds. The regenerative orchards are doing it seems, through this more complex, interconnected, robust ecosystem. The one difference we did see regenerative orchards, the almonds had significantly higher levels of magnesium. This is a little bit of an interesting tidbit. It seems that magnesium content in food has been dropping over the years, and it's been attributed to our more industrial forms of agriculture, which are lower than magnesium levels. In the soil, I don't know, maybe this could be some sort of indicator that, regenerative practices could help bring up some of those nutrient contents. Not really sure. Definitely not saying anything definitively, but it was something, the one that did kind of pop up. I'm wondering if maybe this is some sort of indicator. Definitely a question that could be really interesting to pursue in greater depth. But really overall, no difference in the nutrient profiles between the two management systems. Now a big question in terms of profitability. The regenerative orchards were twice as profitable as their conventional counterparts. When we look at this, really, this seemed to be because of the increased value placed on the regenerative, the almonds grown regenerative. For this study, the orchards were not required to be organic. It just so happened, though, that they all did happen to be organic in the study. A lot of the producers found, with some of this going regenerative, doing a lot of these practices, might as well get some of that premium for the product. Further, even some of the producers were smaller producers, regenerative or smaller producers, were able to directly sell their almonds to the consumers. So as we look at the per hectare operating costs, there's no difference in yields and operating costs between the two systems. So the profits driven by that increased revenue. But if you look at the regenerative orchards, there's quite a bit greater variability in the cost between the regenerative and the conventional systems. The conventional systems, the one if you look at it, it's on the left, they're really just scrunched and really tight. The playbook for growing orchards, producing orchards conventionally, it's been written. People know what to do. People generally, they pretty much do a pretty similar approach. You're going to have really similar operating costs. With the regenerative orchards, though, there's not very many people doing it. The playbook has not been written, and operators are really trying to figure out a way on, how do they make this work? How does it happen? I think that's kind of reflected in what we see, this range of operating costs. It's also kind of interesting, you look at this cost and you look at it, you could potentially say, hey, maybe there could be more room to cut costs going regeneratively. And I think that could definitely, maybe that's something that could be explored further, and that there's more potential to further cut costs if you're looking at regenerative orchards. If we're looking at this, you do see this much bigger range with regards to operating costs in the regenerative orchards. And when you dive down in the data, this comes from the smaller operators in the system. So the ones with the higher costs were these operations that did some of this direct selling. And for some of these direct sellers don't even pasteurize their almonds. And so they afford to do much more expensive things like bringing out tarps and harvesting their almonds off tarps because they brought grazers in. So it's all part of this overall marketing thing. But when we just look at our wholesale regenerative producers who are selling out on the wholesale market, their costs are much more tightly clustered together. So really indicating that producers can bring in cost predictability into their regenerative operations as they dial them in, especially the wholesale market. So I think that's really something to keep in mind from kind of looking at and teasing into the data with regards to costs. So, so now really looking at, so this is some interesting analysis, and we're really trying to figure out here is how are some of these different soil quality and biological components, how are they interacting within the system? So we did some type of analysis called principal component analysis, in which we analyzed soil carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, microbial and actinobacteria biomass, invertebrate biomass, and biodiversity. And we put them into this principal component model. And what we got was that we got these distinct clusters. So in blue, we have our regenerative orchards on the left. On our right, we have our conventional orchards in red. And this really just overall further emphasizes the point that we're seeing these very strong, statistically significant differences between these regenerative systems and these conventional systems. So if we look at this plot, as we move to the left along the x-axis, which is principal component 1, which explains 61% of the variability that we're seeing throughout the entire system, which is pretty quite high. What we're seeing is that we move across the left is that the orchards have lower bulk densities, higher levels of total soil carbon, higher levels of total soil nitrogen and total soil phosphorus, greater microbial and actinobacterial biomasses, and larger and more diverse invertebrate communities as we move to the left. And then what gets really interesting is we did correlation analysis between those metrics I just discussed and these components. And if we look at these soil quality and biological metrics, they all have really highly significant correlations. And what this indicates is that these are all intercorrelated and connected to one another. It really is strongly suggesting that our soil carbon and nitrogen in the top layer and that top 0 to 5 centimeters is really being driven by microbial biomass and actinobacterial biomass, as well as the invertebrate diversity and the overall abundance of the invertebrate community. And then similarly, some of those soil quality metrics are and vice versa, correlating and driving those biological community metrics. So it's really showing that, these regenerative orchards, are these more robust, potentially interconnected ecosystems in which you have these things interacting together in this positive feedback loop and providing these key services for the farmers. And then the other thing too is what we were able to do was we were able to do correlation analysis with regards to the management practices as well as the overall principal components. And what we found is this has allowed us to understand what are the practices that are driving those differences between the two farms. So what are the management practices that's driving having this regenerative cluster on the left and this conventional cluster on the right? And we found was that the key management practices were the avoidance of the synthetic fertilizers, insecticides, and herbicides. We had to group all those had to be grouped together, the statistical analysis. And then having there be permanent ground cover, then followed by no synthetic or metal fungicides, and then the use of organic amendments and compost tea. So was really found, that the key management practices, for these regenerative operations are those ones that I just, went through. And that not only that, it just wasn't just one management practices, but we had these 4 significant management practices. And you really see, again, sort of that emphasis on the importance of this permanent orchard floor ground coverage. I have them listed in terms of the, strength of the correlation coefficients. Yeah, those are the kind of key part that we came out of this study, that there seem to be some key practices for these regenerative orchards that are driving their successes. Really interesting, I just want to highlight, you see not tilling down at the bottom. Generally, when we think of regenerative agriculture, we think not tilling is super important, but the thing is here is that pretty much every orchard in this study did not till, conventional and regenerative. So what it's saying is really, if you think about it, not tilling alone is not enough sort of a regenerative practices to get these improvements in your soil fertility and your soil quality. I think that's a really important point to remember. I think sometimes a lot of times we can just kind of be caught up around, just not tilling and kind of forget about these other management practices. Kind of building on this, sort of these core 4 is a series of analyses in which we looked at what is the impact of stacking regenerative practices. So we did, correlation analysis between regenerative matrix score. So that was what we talked about in the beginning. The more regenerative practices you do, the higher your matrix score, and how that correlated to all of our soil quality and biodiversity metrics. And we found is that as you increase the number of practices that you do, you get higher results with regards to your metrics. Right here is just an example with invertebrate species diversity. So, looking at the more practices you do, the greater diversity. Right here are just some pictures kind of highlighting that. Here's a setup for creating compost and compost teas on the picture, as well as this ground cover, permanent ground cover, and then sheep being integrated into that orchard. So really highlighting, it takes multiple practices. More you do, the better. And it really takes, it's a core amount of practices it takes to really see these results. So overall, we did it. We're almost done. Second to last slide here. So really to summarize is that these regenerative orchards, they perform better than the conventional ones with regards to key soil quality metrics. They had greater biodiversity and similar yields while being more profitable, with that profit being driven by the value added placed on their products. We saw significant correlation between improved invertebrate and arthropod diversity and reduced pest damage. We saw that these regenerative orchards seem to be building up their soil carbon and their soil fertility, this key soil fertility indicator, while conventional orchards seem to be losing this soil carbon. Further, we saw significant correlations between the biological community and our soil quality metrics, suggesting that they are interconnected and somewhat driving each other. Then looking at with regards to soil carbon and management practices, it really seems that for building this carbon, maintaining that orchard floor ground coverage is really, really important. And then the practices that are driving the overall performance differences between these regenerative and conventional orchards is the avoidance of synthetic inputs, permanent ground cover, and the use of organic amendments. And then, building on that, we also saw these significant correlations between stacking and doing more regenerative practices and improved overall metrics that we observed in the study. So really, that's kind of wraps it up. Some fairly, exciting results, I'd say, that we found in this study. Our next step is to do a transitional study to quantify, how these changes, how quickly they're taking place, what's going on as orchards work to transition from conventional to regenerative. I mentioned in my other shorter presentation, we're actively still recruiting and looking for farms that are looking to transition, as well as maybe farms who are already doing some of these practices. So if you would be interested in participating in a study, we share all of our data and research with the farmers and really try to look to make long-standing relationships. Really, please feel free to reach out. My email, I'm sure, will be available through this format. I think it's in the beginning of the presentation. On that, I want to say thank you to the farmers who drove the questions. really created this project, catalyzed this project happening. Advisors, the whole team at Ecdysis, Dr. John Lundgren, as well as multiple of their lab mates, other advisor at Cal State East Bay, Dr. Patty Okawa and Dr. Erica Wilde, and then all the great undergrads who worked in the lab. They just did amazing work. They were Chris, Hillary, and Ali who worked on this project with me at Cal State East Bay, and I really, it wouldn't have been impossible to do without them, and it was a lot of fun. And yeah, as well as some of the main funders for this project. So on that, I want to say thank you very much. Really enjoy my time, and yeah, hopefully I'll be at that that forum or that question session for that live question and answer session. So thank you.